August 17, 1943. 26,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. 376 B-17 flying fortresses thunder through hostile skies, their contrails painting white streaks across the blue. Below, Nazi ball-bearing factories, the heart of Hitler's war machine. Ahead, a wall of flak so thick you could walk on it. And closing fast, swarms of Luftwaffe fighters with one mission: shoot down every single American bomber. But before we dive in, let me ask you this. What if I told you that one B-17 returned from a mission with its nose completely blown off, yet still landed safely? That another came back with over 400 bullet holes? That crews nicknamed it the Flying Fortress, not because it was indestructible, but because when everything went wrong, engines shot out, tail shredded, hydraulics bleeding into the bomb bay, it somehow kept flying? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why the B-17 Flying Fortress is considered the most iconic bomber in aviation history, the aircraft that proved strategic bombing could win wars, and the machine that Nazi fighter pilots learned to fear above all others. The Germans called American bomber crews Terrorfliegers, terror flyers. They knew that every B-17 formation meant another piece of their industrial capacity would be reduced to rubble. Every mission meant their fuel refineries, their aircraft factories, their ball-bearing plants would burn. The Luftwaffe threw everything at them: cannon shells, rockets, even aerial bombs dropped from above. They rammed B-17s in desperate suicide attacks. Yet the fortresses kept coming. Day after day. Wave after wave. 30,000 feet up, in temperatures 60 degrees below zero, where the air was so thin men could barely breathe, these bombers fought their way through the most lethal airspace ever created. Here's what makes this story remarkable. The B-17 almost never existed. Its prototype crashed and burned before the military would buy it. The company that built it nearly went bankrupt. Army generals called it too expensive, too complicated, too ambitious. Boeing bet everything on an aircraft nobody wanted. And yet, by 1945, over 12,700 B-17s had been built. They flew more than 290,000 combat sorties, dropped 640,000 tons of bombs, and helped destroy Nazi Germany's ability to wage war. Fortresses shot down thousands of enemy fighters, earned countless medals of honor, and became the symbol of American airpower. But this isn't just a story about an airplane. It's about the 350,000 men who flew them into hell, teenagers from Iowa and Brooklyn and Texas who climbed into aluminum tubes every morning knowing their odds of completing 25 missions were barely 1 in 4. It's about formations that left England with 300 bombers and returned with 200. About crews who watched their friends explode beside them, yet climbed back into the cockpit the next day. And if you're a fan of WWII aviation history, hit that subscribe button. We're covering every legendary warbird from the greatest conflict in history, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, to understand why the B-17 became the most feared bomber, we need to go back to where it all began, to a problem that threatened America's very security. To understand the B-17 Flying Fortress, we need to go back to 1934, a world still recovering from the carnage of the Great War, yet already watching storm clouds gather over Europe and Asia. The United States Army Air Corps faced a critical dilemma. America's coastline stretched over 12,000 miles. Hawaii sat vulnerable in the Pacific. The Panama Canal represented a strategic choke point that enemies would love to destroy. And the existing bomber fleet? Obsolete biplanes that could barely reach 200 miles with a meaningful bomb load. Military strategists knew what was coming. Another war. But this time, it wouldn't be fought in muddy trenches. The next conflict would be won or lost in the skies, through strategic bombing that could cripple an enemy's ability to wage war before armies even met on the ground. Brigadier General Frank Andrews understood this better than most. He championed a radical concept: long-range bombers that could strike deep into enemy territory, destroy factories, oil refineries, and transportation networks, then return home. Precision daylight bombing. Strike the enemy's industrial heart, and you win the war without sacrificing millions of infantrymen. But there was one massive problem. No such aircraft existed. The Air Corps' current heavy bomber, the Martin B-10, had a range of just 590 miles and carried only 2,260 pounds of bombs. It was revolutionary for 1932, but woefully inadequate for the coming war. You couldn't defend Alaska with it. You couldn't strike back against an invasion fleet approaching San Francisco. And you certainly couldn't project American power across an ocean. The stakes couldn't be higher. Without long-range strategic bombers, America would remain defensively weak, unable to deter aggression or strike back effectively if attacked. The nation needed a bomber that could fly 2,000 miles, carry a substantial bomb load, defend itself against enemy fighters, and return its crew safely home. In August 1934, the Army Air Corps issued a specification that would change aviation history forever. They called it Project A competition to build a multi-engine bomber capable of carrying a 1-ton bomb load for 2,000 miles at over 200 miles per hour. Most aircraft manufacturers assumed multi-engine meant 2 engines. That's what made sense. That's what was affordable. But one company in Seattle had a different vision entirely. A vision so ambitious, so expensive, and so risky that it would nearly bankrupt them. But the solution would come from an unexpected place, and it would arrive with 4 engines instead of 2. Enter Boeing, a company that had spent the 1920s building mostly male planes and trainers, dreaming of something greater. In Seattle, a team led by Chief Engineer Edward Curtis Wells huddled over drafting tables with a radical proposal. While Boeing's competitors Douglas and Martin prepared twin-engine designs for Project A, Wells and his team sketched something nobody expected, a 4-engine behemoth that would redefine what a bomber could be. The gamble was enormous. Boeing's board of directors authorized spending $275,000 of company funds, nearly bankrupting the firm, to build a prototype without any guarantee the Army would buy it. In 1934, during the Great Depression, this was corporate suicide. But Boeing's leadership believed in strategic bombing theory, and they knew 2 engines wouldn't cut it. The design philosophy was revolutionary. Wells envisioned a bomber that didn't just carry bombs, it defended itself. The name came early, Model 299, internally. But when reporters saw the prototype bristling with machine gun positions, they coined a different name, Flying Fortress. 4 750 horsepower Pratt & Whitney Hornet radial engines gave the 299 unprecedented power. The wing, a beautiful, efficient design spanning 103 feet, provided lift even at high altitude where most aircraft struggled. The fuselage stretched 68 feet, sleek and purposeful, with a distinctive greenhouse nose for the bombardier. But here's where it gets interesting. Boeing didn't just build a bigger bomber. They revolutionized bomber design entirely. They added 5 machine gun positions, nose, dorsal, ventral, and 2 waist positions, giving 360-degree defensive coverage. No previous bomber had anything close. The theory, a formation of these fortresses could create overlapping fields of fire so deadly that enemy fighters wouldn't dare attack. The bomb bay could carry 4,800 pounds internally, more than double what Projecta specified. The aircraft incorporated cutting-edge technology, retractable landing gear to reduce drag, variable pitch propellers, and an advanced oxygen system for high-altitude flight. Test pilot Les Tower took the controls as the 299 took shape in Boeing's Seattle plant. Every rivet, every aluminum panel, every system represented Boeing's bet on the future of warfare. On July 28, 1935, the moment of truth arrived. The massive silver bomber sat on Boeing Field's runway, sunlight gleaming off its polished aluminum skin. 4 engines roared to life. Tower advanced the throttles. The 299 accelerated, lifted gracefully into the Seattle sky, and performed flawlessly. But the real test came 9 days later. Boeing had to deliver the prototype to Wright Field in Ohio for Army evaluation, a 2,100-mile journey across the country. Most aircraft would need multiple stops, taking days. Tower and his crew departed Seattle on August 20th and arrived at Wright Field 9 hours later, non-stop, averaging 232 miles per hour. The Army evaluators were stunned. This wasn't just meeting specifications, this was obliterating them. Flight tests continued through September. The 299 outperformed both competitors dramatically. It flew faster, farther, and carried more bombs than anyone thought possible. Army Air Corps officers who believed in strategic bombing saw their dreams taking physical form. General Henry Hap Arnold watched demonstrations and knew this aircraft could change everything. Newspaper reporters swarmed. Headlines proclaimed the Flying Fortress as the future of air power. Boeing's engineers refined systems, fixed minor issues, and prepared for the final Army demonstration that would secure a production contract. Everything was falling into place perfectly. Boeing's gamble was about to pay off spectacularly. October 30th, 1935 would determine the company's future. One final demonstration flight for the Army brass, then Boeing would receive orders for potentially hundreds of bombers. Test pilot Les Tower ran through his pre-flight checklist. Everything looked good. He climbed aboard with a crew of 4. Engines fired up. The Tu-99 rolled onto right field's runway. Tower released the brakes and advanced throttles. The Fortress accelerated smoothly. At rotation speed, Tower pulled back on the yoke. The nose didn't lift. The controls were locked. In the rush of preparations, someone had left the external gust locks engaged, a safety device that prevents wind from moving the control surfaces while parked. Tower fought the controls as the bomber hurtled down the runway at full power, unable to climb. The Tu-99 staggered into the air, barely, then immediately stalled. It rolled left, the wing dug into the ground, and Boeing's dream exploded in a fireball of fuel and magnesium. Tower and one crew member died from their injuries. Boeing's prototype, the only Model Tu-99 in existence, was destroyed. Douglas Aircraft's twin-engine B-17 won the contract by default. Boeing's $275,000 investment literally went up in smoke. The company teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. However, what happened during the first test flight would shock everyone involved, and a handful of believers would refuse to let the Flying Fortress die. The first B-17 Flying Fortress took to the skies on December 2, 1936, not as a production bomber, but as a desperate second chance. Despite the crash, a small group of Army Air Corps officers refused to abandon the 4-engine concept. They'd seen what the Tu-99 could do before the accident. They knew strategic bombing required exactly this kind of aircraft. Led by General Frank Andrews, these believers convinced the Army to order 13 service test aircraft designated Y-1 B-17. Boeing, still reeling financially from the crash, poured everything into getting it right this time. Engineers created something that would become standard on every complex aircraft from that day forward, the pre-flight checklist. Simple, systematic, foolproof, the kind of innovation born from tragedy. The Y-1 B-17 differed from the prototype in crucial ways. Wright Cyclone engines replaced the Hornets, providing 930 horsepower each. The fuselage was refined. Systems were improved. And every pilot would now methodically check every control surface, every system, every lock before touching the throttles. Flight testing revealed both promise and problems. The Fortress flew beautifully at high altitude, 25,000 feet and above, where its supercharged engines and efficient wing design gave it advantages no other bomber possessed. Up there, in the thin, freezing air, it could outrun most fighters of the era. But the machine guns were another story. At high altitude, temperatures dropped to 60 below zero. Guns froze. Ammunition feeds jammed. Gunners couldn't operate weapons while wearing thick gloves, but they couldn't survive without them. The oxygen system struggled. Crew members passed out from hypoxia during tests. Boeing engineers went back to work. They developed electrically heated flight suits, improved oxygen regulators, redesigned gun mounts for gloved hands, added boot heating systems. Every problem became a solution, and every solution made the Fortress more capable. Then came the political battle. Army Ground Forces generals hated the B-17. Too expensive at $240,000 per aircraft compared to $58,000 for a B-18. Too complicated. Too specialized. They argued that America needed many cheap bombers, not a few expensive ones. The Navy called it a threat to their budget. Isolationist politicians questioned why America needed long-range bombers at all. But strategic bombing advocates fought back. They staged dramatic demonstrations. In May 1938, 3 Y-1 B-17s intercepted the Italian ocean liner Rex 700 miles out in the Atlantic, proving the Fortress could find and attack ships far from American shores. Newsreels showed the silver bombers circling the massive ship. The public loved it. The Navy was furious. General Hap Arnold became the Fortress's most powerful champion. He understood that the next war would require striking deep into enemy territory, and only the B-17 could do it. He pushed for production orders despite intense opposition. In 1939, the Army finally authorized 39 B-17Bs, the first true production model. These featured a redesigned nose, improved turbo superchargers, and a larger rudder for better control. Boeing's assembly line slowly came to life. Then came the B-17C and D models with even more improvements: self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent fires, additional armor plate to protect the crew, and better guns. The British Royal Air Force, desperate for bombers, ordered 20 Fortresses and designated them the Fortress I. But here's where things took a dramatic turn. In July 1941, RAF Bomber Command sent their Fortresses on daylight raids over Germany. The results were disastrous. Poor training, mechanical issues, and tactics designed for low-altitude night bombing led to heavy losses with minimal damage to targets. The RAF quickly withdrew the Fortress from combat, declaring it unsuitable for European operations. American officials panicked. Had they spent years and millions of dollars on a bomber that couldn't survive combat? Boeing engineers studied the RAF reports carefully. The problems weren't with the aircraft itself, they were with how it was being used. The Fortress was designed for high-altitude precision bombing in tight formations, not the low-level operations the RAF attempted. Given proper tactics and training, the B-17 could work. They went back to the drawing board one more time. The B-17E emerged in September 1941, a dramatically improved aircraft. The tail was completely redesigned with a massive dorsal fin for stability. A tail gun position was added, eliminating the Fortress's vulnerable rear blind spot. The ventral ball turret, a rotating sphere with twin .50 caliber machine guns, gave coverage below. Top turret, nose guns, waist guns. The E model truly earned the name Flying Fortress with 13 machine guns total. Production ramped up dramatically. Boeing's Seattle plant couldn't build them fast enough, so Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach and Lockheed's Vega division began building B-17s under license. Assembly lines worked around the clock. By December 7, 1941, when Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the Army Air Corps possessed fewer than 200 B-17 scattered across various bases. Most were older models. Crews were undertrained. Tactics were still being developed. America was now at war, and the Flying Fortress was about to face its real test, not in controlled evaluations, but in actual combat where mistakes meant death. But its real test was about to come in actual combat, and the lessons would be written in blood across the skies of 2 continents. August 17, 1942. Rouen-Sotteville, France. 12 B-17Es from the 97th Bombardment Group climbed through the morning sky over England, beginning the United States Army Air Force's first heavy bomber mission against Nazi-occupied Europe. But the B-17's baptism of fire actually began 8 months earlier, 6,000 miles away in the Pacific. December 7, 1941. While the main Japanese attack struck Pearl Harbor, a flight of B-17s was approaching Hawaii from California, unarmed, low on fuel, expecting a peaceful landing. Instead, they flew straight into the chaos. Japanese Zeros attacked them. Several Fortresses were damaged, one crashed, yet most managed emergency landings despite the attack. It was a brutal welcome to war. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur's force included 35 B-17s, the largest concentration of heavy bombers outside the United States. On December 8, Japanese bombers caught most of them on the ground at Clark Field and destroyed them. The few surviving Fortresses conducted desperate raids against Japanese invasion forces, but lack of spare parts, ammunition, and support doomed them. By March 1942, the last B-17s evacuated to Australia. The Pacific taught harsh lessons. The Fortress could survive incredible damage. One returned with over 100 bullet holes. But it needed bases, logistics, trained crews, and fighter escort to be truly effective. Europe would be different. It had to be. The first B-17E groups arrived in England in spring 1942. The 97th Bombardment Group, commanded by Colonel Frank Armstrong, would spearhead the American daylight bombing campaign. British officers were skeptical. They'd tried daylight bombing and suffered catastrophic losses. The RAF now flew only at night. But American doctrine was clear: precision daylight bombing in tight formation at high altitude. The theory was that massed defensive firepower from dozens of fortresses would repel enemy fighters, while the famous Norden bombsight would enable pinpoint accuracy from 25,000 feet. Reality would prove messier. Brigadier General Ira Eaker commanded the fledgling 8th Air Force Bomber Command. He knew the world was watching. If this first mission failed, the entire American strategy and the B-17 program could be scrapped. The target, the Sotteville rail yards near Rouen, just 60 miles from the English coast. A relatively easy mission to build confidence. RAF Spitfires would escort the bombers all the way. On that August morning, 12 fortresses lifted off from Grafton Underwood. Major Paul Tibbets, who would later fly the Enola Gay, piloted the lead aircraft, Butcher Shop, carrying General Eaker as an observer. The bombers formed up over England, then turned toward France. Crossing the Channel at 23,000 feet, gunners scanned the sky for enemy fighters. The formation remained tight, each pilot holding precise position. Below, the French coast appeared through scattered clouds. Then came the Flak. Black puffs of exploding anti-aircraft shells blossomed around the formation. The fortresses shuddered from near misses. Shrapnel pinged against aluminum skin. But the pilots held steady, trusting their armor and self-sealing tanks. The target appeared ahead. Bombardiers hunched over their Norden sights, making final adjustments. The bomb bay doors rumbled open. Bombs away! 18 tons of high explosives tumbled toward the rail yards. The fortresses immediately banked away, heading for home. Behind them, explosions erupted across the target. Reconnaissance photos would later show significant damage to the marshalling yards and repair shops. German fighters did appear, Focke-Wulf 190s diving through the formation, but the escorting Spitfires drove them off. The massed .50 caliber guns from 12 fortresses created a wall of tracers that made the Germans cautious. All 12 bombers returned to England. Not one was shot down. Only minor damage. Crews were jubilant. The headlines proclaimed victory. U.S. bombers blast France, read American newspapers. Churchill sent congratulations. The doubters seemed answered. But this was the easy part. Over the next months, missions grew larger and deeper into occupied territory. September 6th, 37 fortresses hit Lille. October 9th, 108 bombers struck the Lille steelworks in the largest American raid yet. The tactics were working. Losses remained acceptable, around 2 to 3% per mission. Crews began to believe the fortress was invincible. Tight formations, overlapping defensive fire, high altitude, the doctrine seemed sound. Then they started flying beyond fighter escort range. January 27, 1943. Wilhelmshaven, Germany, the first American raid on the German homeland. The Luftwaffe defenders were waiting. Without escort fighters, the B-17s faced wave after wave of German interceptors. FW-190s and Bf-109s attacked from head-on, where the fortress's defensive guns were weakest. 3 bombers went down. Many others limped home shot full of holes. The crews learned that day, over Germany, without escorts, it was going to be hell. February and March brought more deep penetration raids. Bremen, Kiel, Leipzig. Loss rates climbed to 5%, then 7%. The math was brutal. At 7% losses, a crew's chances of completing 25 missions dropped below 25%. But the fortress kept proving its toughness. Planes returned with engines shot out, tail sections shredded, wings peppered with cannon holes. One landed with a dead engine and half its rudder missing. Another came back with the top turret blown completely off. The structural strength Boeing had built into the design kept saving lives. Stories spread through the bomber groups. A B-17 named Old Bill took a direct flak hit that blew a 6-foot hole through the wing and kept flying. Another lost its entire nose section to a German fighter's cannon and still made it home. The crews began to trust their aircraft. By spring 1943, the 8th Air Force had proven the B-17 could survive combat. They'd flown hundreds of sorties, dropped thousands of tons of bombs, and established tactics that worked. This was just the beginning. What came next would cement its legendary status and cost the lives of thousands. By summer 1943, the B-17 Flying Fortress was at the height of its power, and so were the defenses trying to destroy it. The 8th Air Force had grown into an armada. Hundreds of fortresses now blackened English skies each morning, forming up into massive combat boxes, staggered formations designed to maximize defensive firepower. The raids went deeper. Berlin, Schweinfurt, Regensburg. Every mission pushed farther into the heart of Nazi Germany. The new B-17G model arrived with a critical improvement, a chin turret with twin .50 caliber guns beneath the nose. German fighters had learned to attack head-on, where earlier fortresses were weakest. The G model eliminated that vulnerability. Now the fortress had 13 heavy machine guns covering every approach angle. But here's where it gets interesting. The Luftwaffe adapted too. German fighter tactics evolved into something terrifying. They'd gather in large formations, 40, 60, sometimes 100 fighters, then attack in coordinated waves. FW-190s would slash through from the front, firing 20mm cannons and rockets. Bf-109s would dive from above. Twin-engine Bf-110s hung back at long range, launching 21 cm rockets into the bomber formations. Some German fighters even dropped aerial bombs onto the formations from above. The most desperate attacked with guns empty, ramming B-17s in suicide attacks. Luftwaffe pilots knew they were defending their homes, their families, their country from bombs that were reducing German cities to ash. June 22, 1943. The Hulse synthetic rubber plant. The mission briefing promised heavy resistance, but nothing prepared the crews for what came. Over 200 B-17s struck the target through intense flak. German fighters swarmed like hornets. 16 fortresses went down that day, 160 men killed or captured. But post-strike photos showed the plant devastated. Its production stopped for months. This was the trade. Terrible losses for strategic gains. The question was, could America sustain it? Let me tell you about the Memphis Belle. Piloted by Captain Robert Morgan, this B-17F became the first heavy bomber in Europe to complete 25 missions, the magic number that meant a crew could go home. On May 17, 1943, the Belle flew its final mission to Lorient, France. All 10 crew members survived their tour. Hollywood director William Wyler documented their story, and the Memphis Belle became a symbol of hope. You could survive 25 missions and make it home. But the Belle was an exception. Most crews didn't make it. July 28, 1943. Ostjersleben. The 100th Bomb Group earned its nickname, the Bloody 100th, that day. German fighters singled out their formation and tore it apart. 9 of 13 fortresses from the 100th went down in flames over Germany. Parachutes blossomed across the sky as survivors bailed out. Those who made it to the ground faced years in prisoner-of-war camps. The worst was yet to come. August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year after that first symbolic raid on Rouen. The target, Schweinfurt and Regensburg, Germany's ball-bearing and aircraft factories. The plan called for 376 fortresses to strike both targets in a coordinated double blow. The Regensburg force would hit their target, then continue south to land in North Africa, a shuttle mission designed to confuse German defenses. The Schweinfurt force would follow, hitting the ball-bearing plants while the Luftwaffe was still recovering. Weather delayed the Schweinfurt force. The Germans weren't confused at all. The Regensburg force fought through wave after wave of German fighters. Without escort beyond the German border, the fortresses were on their own for over 400 miles of hostile airspace. 24 bombers went down on the way to the target. The survivors pressed on, dropped their bombs accurately, then ran for Africa with German fighters pursuing until fuel forced them to break off. Hours later, the Schweinfurt force finally launched. The Luftwaffe was waiting, rearmed and refueled. The fighting was apocalyptic. German fighters made over 700 individual attacks on the American formation. 36 fortresses fell from the sky over Germany, spinning down in flames, breaking apart, exploding mid-air. But stay with me, because this next part is crucial. Despite everything, despite 60 bombers shot down, 600 men killed or captured, many more wounded, the formations held. Bomb runs were completed. Both factories suffered significant damage. Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production dropped 38%. One B-17 named Thunderbird took 5 20mm cannon shells through the fuselage, had 2 engines knocked out, and lost hydraulics. The pilot, Lieutenant Harold Giddings, coaxed it back to England on 2 engines, then belly-landed in a field because the landing gear wouldn't extend. All 10 crew members walked away. Another fortress, damaged and separated from the formation, was attacked by over 30 German fighters during its lonely flight home. The crew fought off attack after attack for 90 minutes. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warner, was credited with 5 kills. They made it back. These stories multiplied across dozens of missions. The B-17F Hells Angels completed 48 missions, nearly twice the required tour, before being retired. Another, the Jersey Bounce Jr., survived 68 missions. Pilots like Robert Morgan, John Lucky, Luckadoo, and Robert Rosenthal became legends for bringing damaged fortresses home again and again. You won't believe what happened during some of these returns. Fortresses landed with dead engines, destroyed tail sections, and massive holes through wings and fuselage. One came back with the top of its fuselage torn open. You could see straight through the aircraft from above. The crew survived in the lower sections. The Luftwaffe learned to respect the fortress. German fighter pilot reports describe the terrifying wall of .50 caliber tracers streaming from a tight formation. Like flying into a buzzsaw, one pilot wrote. They developed tactics specifically for B-17s. Attack from 12 o'clock high where the closure rate was fastest, aim for the cockpit to kill the pilots, or target engines to force stragglers out of formation. By October 1943, the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt for a second raid. This time, 291 fortresses launched. 60 were shot down, a catastrophic 20% loss rate. Another 17 were so badly damaged they never flew again. Over 600 men were casualties in a single day. The loss rate was unsustainable. Crews' chances of completing 25 missions had dropped to nearly 0. Something had to change. But every legend has its darkest moment, and for the Flying Fortress, that moment would force a complete rethinking of the daylight bombing campaign. Despite its success, the B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't invincible, and by late 1943, the casualties proved it. The mathematics of survival were brutal. At a 5% loss rate per mission, a crew had only a 28% chance of completing 25 missions alive. When losses spiked to 10% or higher on deep penetration raids, the odds became nearly impossible. Crews watched their friends disappear mission after mission, knowing their turn was coming. The fortress had vulnerabilities the designers never fully solved. Flak, anti-aircraft artillery, killed more B-17s than fighters. German 88mm guns fired shells that exploded at precise altitudes, sending white-hot shrapnel through aluminum skin, hydraulic lines, fuel tanks, and human bodies. The shells burst in black clouds that appeared deceptively harmless until you flew through them and felt the aircraft shudder from impacts. Flak was inescapable. You couldn't dodge it. You flew straight and level on the bomb run while explosions bracketed your aircraft. The pilots held formation. The bombardiers hunched over their sights. And everyone prayed the next shell wouldn't have their name on it. One direct hit could vaporize a B-17. More often, Flak wounded aircraft slowly, puncturing hydraulic systems, severing control cables, igniting fires. A fortress might survive the target area only to lose altitude steadily, falling behind the formation, becoming easy prey for fighters. German fighters evolved deadlier tactics specifically designed to kill fortresses. The head-on attack, diving at 400 miles per hour closure speed, firing cannons and machine guns, then breaking away just before collision, gave gunners only seconds to react. Even with the chin turret on the G model, many German rounds found their mark. The Luftwaffe developed specialized weapons. The 21 cm rocket, a massive projectile that could destroy a B-17 with a near miss, was launched from beyond .50 caliber range. Twin-engine night fighters mounting heavy cannons attacked from below, where the ball turret had limited traverse. Some German fighters even carried aerial bombs to drop into formations from above. Then there was the weather. Flying at 25,000 feet meant temperatures of 60 degrees below zero. Oxygen systems failed. Heated flight suits malfunctioned. Crew members suffered frostbite that cost them fingers and toes. Windows frosted over. Controls froze. Men passed out from hypoxia and died at their stations. The cold caused guns to jam at critical moments. Gunners would fire a test burst, watch the tracers stream out, then find their guns frozen solid when enemy fighters appeared. Maintenance crews worked through English winters trying to keep systems functioning, but some problems had no solution. Structural failures happened. The stresses of combat maneuvers, flak damage, and German cannon fire sometimes exceeded what the airframe could withstand. Wings broke off. Tail sections separated. Fuselages cracked open. When a B-17 broke up at altitude, the crew had seconds to bail out before centrifugal forces trapped them inside. Bailout itself was terrifyingly difficult. In the thin air at 25,000 feet, men struggled with jammed escape hatches, tangled parachute harnesses, and aircraft spinning out of control. Many died trying to escape. Those who successfully bailed out faced German flak fire during their descent, then capture and years in POW camps if they survived landing. Let me tell you about Lieutenant Charles Brown's experience on December 20, 1943. His B-17F, ye old pub, was shot to pieces over Bremen. One engine destroyed, another barely running, oxygen system shot out, tail gunner dead, other crew wounded. Brown, barely conscious from blood loss, somehow kept the crippled fortress flying at treetop level. A German fighter pilot, Franz Stigler, spotted the dying bomber and closed in for the kill. But when Stigler pulled alongside and saw the devastation, the dead gunner, the wounded crew, the aircraft held together by hope, he couldn't fire. Instead, he escorted the crippled fortress toward the coast, waving off other German fighters. At the English Channel, Stigler saluted and turned away. Brown's experience wasn't unique in its damage. Dozens of fortresses absorbed similar punishment. What made it remarkable was the mercy. Usually, a damaged straggler meant certain death. The psychological toll broke men. Some crews developed what doctors called operational fatigue, what we'd now call PTSD. Hands trembled. Nightmares prevented sleep. Some men couldn't force themselves into the aircraft. The shame of being LMF, lacking in moral fiber, drove some to suicide rather than face the accusation of cowardice. Others developed elaborate superstitions. Lucky socks. Special rituals before missions. Mascots. Prayer. Anything to create the illusion of control in a situation where randomness determined survival. The life expectancy of a B-17 in heavy combat was just 11 missions in late 1943. Some lasted far longer, dozens of missions. Others were destroyed on their first raid. There was no pattern, no way to predict which aircraft would come home. Ball turret gunners faced special horror. Trapped in a plexiglass sphere beneath the bomber, they couldn't wear parachutes, no room. If the aircraft was fatally hit and the turret's power failed, they couldn't manually crank themselves back inside. Some men died trapped in their turrets as B-17s crashed or burned. The Air Force tried everything to reduce losses. Formation tactics were refined constantly. Fighter escort was extended as far as fuel allowed. Flak suppression tactics were developed. Improved oxygen systems and heated suits were rushed into service. But fundamentally, the mission remained the same. Fly through the most lethal airspace ever created, in broad daylight, and bomb targets defended by thousands of anti-aircraft guns and hundreds of fighters. The losses continued. By December 1943, some military leaders questioned whether daylight bombing could continue. The cost in aircraft and trained crews was staggering. The German war industry, despite thousands of tons of bombs, kept producing weapons. Yet, one mission would prove why this aircraft earned its place in history, and demonstrate that courage and determination could overcome even the most desperate odds. February 20, 1944. The mission briefing at Thorpe Abbotts revealed a target that made even veteran crews go silent. Leipzig, Germany, deep in the heart of the Third Reich, 500 miles from England, beyond the range of any fighter escort. But this wasn't just another raid. This was part of Big Week, a concentrated offensive designed to destroy the Luftwaffe once and for all by obliterating Germany's aircraft factories. 7 days of maximum effort. Every available bomber. Every crew. The 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, would lead the attack. Major Robert "Rosie" Rosenthal, a 25-year-old pilot who'd already survived more missions than most, commanded his B-17G, Royal Flush, positioned at the front of the formation. The morning was crystal clear, perfect bombing weather, terrible for survival. German radar would track them from the moment they crossed the coast. At 0900 hours, over 400 B-17s lifted off from bases across England. The roar of 1,600 engines shook the countryside. Formations assembled over the channel, a sky filled with aluminum and steel, then turned east toward Germany. The fighter escort, P-47 Thunderbolts, could only accompany them to the German border. After that, the fortresses were alone for over 300 miles of hostile airspace. The P-47 pilots waggled their wings in farewell and turned back, fuel exhausted. The Luftwaffe had been waiting. German controllers tracked the massive formation on radar and scrambled every available fighter within 100 miles. They knew where the bombers were going. The contrails at 25,000 feet painted a white arrow pointing straight toward Leipzig. The first attacks came at 1,045 hours. Bf-109s dove from 30,000 feet, screaming down through the formations with cannons blazing. FW-190s attacked from the front, 12 o'clock level, firing rockets and 30mm cannons that could tear a B-17 apart with a single hit. The sky filled with tracers, smoke, and burning aircraft. Rosenthal held formation as German fighters pressed home attacks so close he could see the pilots' faces. His gunners fired until barrels glowed red-hot. Empty shell casings piled up inside the fuselage. The smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid filled the aircraft. A fortress ahead exploded in mid-air, a direct hit on the bomb bay. The shockwave rocked Royal Flush. Pieces of the destroyed bomber tumbled past. Parachutes blossomed, but not enough. Most of the crew never got out. Another B-17 fell away with 2 engines burning, going down in a slow spiral. Then another. And another. The formations were bleeding bombers. But here's where things took a dramatic turn. The formations didn't break. Despite losses, despite fear, the remaining fortresses held position and pressed on. This was the doctrine, strength through mutual defense. Break formation and you died alone. Stay together and you had a chance. The Flak began at 1,130 hours. Leipzig's defenders put up a wall of 88mm fire so dense it looked like a black cloud. The fortresses flew straight into it. The bomb run required 7 minutes of perfectly straight and level flight. 7 minutes while German gunners refined their range and poured shells into the sky. Royal Flush shuddered from near misses. Shrapnel punched holes through the wings. The No. 3 engine took a hit and started streaming oil. Rosenthal feathered the prop and kept flying. Around him, more fortresses fell. One took a direct hit that sheared off its tail section. The aircraft tumbled forward, spinning faster and faster. No parachutes. Bombardiers across the formation hunched over their Norden sights, making final corrections. The target, the Erla Maskinenwerk aircraft factory, appeared through scattered clouds below. Bombs away. 12,000 pounds of high explosives dropped from each aircraft. Nearly 500 tons fell toward the factory complex in a concentrated pattern. The fortresses immediately banked away, bomb bay doors closing, heading for home. Below, the explosions walked across the factory. Assembly halls erupted in flames. Manufacturing equipment was crushed under collapsed roofs. Production lines that had built dozens of Bf-109s per month ceased to exist. But the mission wasn't over. The flight home meant another 300 miles through German fighters, and the Luftwaffe wasn't done. Wave after wave of attacks continued. The Germans focused on damaged stragglers, aircraft with smoking engines, visible battle damage, planes falling behind formation. These wounded fortresses attracted fighters like sharks to blood. Rosenthal's No. 3 engine was completely dead now, windmilling uselessly in the slipstream. Royal Flush struggled to maintain altitude and position. German pilots saw the struggling bomber and moved in for the kill. What happened next would be repeated in dozens of aircraft across the formation. The crew refused to give up. The top turret gunner, the waist gunners, the ball turret, every gun position engaged the attacking fighters. They didn't have to shoot down every attacker. They just had to make each attack costly enough that the German pilots broke off. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Lester Schrenk, fought off attack after attack from behind. His guns jammed twice. Each time he cleared them manually in 60 below zero temperatures while fighters closed in. He was credited with 2 kills that day. At 1,400 hours, friendly fighters appeared, P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks, the new long-range escorts that could finally accompany bombers deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe broke off immediately. The Germans had learned not to tangle with Mustangs. The English coast appeared at 1,520 hours. Crews who'd been at combat stations for over 6 hours finally relaxed. But the ordeal wasn't finished. Damaged aircraft now faced the challenge of landing. Royal Flush approached Thorpe Abbotts on 3 engines. Rosenthal lined up carefully, compensating for the dead engine. The landing gear came down. Flaps extended. The big bomber settled onto the runway and rolled to a stop. Ground crews counted over 40 flak holes in the fuselage and wings. One propeller blade was nearly shot off. Hydraulic lines had been severed and jury-rigged by the flight engineer. The aircraft had come within inches of catastrophic failure multiple times. Across all the bases, the returning aircraft told the same story. Battle damage. Wounded crew. Dead engines. Yet most made it home. The cost was high. 21 B-17s were shot down over Leipzig, 210 men killed or captured. Many more aircraft were damaged beyond repair. But the Erla factory was devastated. Production stopped for weeks. Dozens of fighters that would never face Allied bombers again. This mission encapsulated everything about the B-17 flying fortress. Yes, it was vulnerable. Yes, men died. But the combination of structural toughness, defensive firepower, and sheer determination allowed formations to complete their missions even through hell itself. Post-strike reconnaissance photos showed the Leipzig factories smashed. Similar results came from raids on Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and Schweinfurt during Big Week. In 7 days, the 8th Air Force flew over 3,000 bomber sorties and dropped 10,000 tons of bombs on German aircraft production. The Luftwaffe lost 355 fighters in air combat during Big Week, losses they could never replace. Their pilot training program couldn't produce experienced aviators fast enough. The quality of German fighter pilots began a steady decline from which it never recovered. The B-17 formations had broken the Luftwaffe's back. As the war progressed, the flying fortress would continue to evolve, and the arrival of long-range fighter escorts would transform the bombing campaign into something the Germans could no longer stop. By spring 1944, warfare was changing, and the B-17 flying fortress was changing with it. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang fighter with drop tanks revolutionized the bombing campaign. For the first time, American fighters could escort B-17s all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe, which had once attacked bomber formations with impunity, now faced swarms of Mustangs that were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by increasingly experienced pilots. The loss rate dropped dramatically. Missions that would have cost 10% losses in 1943 now saw 2 to 3% casualties. Crews' chances of completing their tours jumped from nearly impossible to actually achievable. The 25 mission requirement was raised to 30, then 35 missions as survival odds improved. The B-17G remained the primary production model, but modifications kept appearing. Late production G models featured improved turbochargers for better high-altitude performance. Some received H-2X radar bombing equipment, called Mickey by crews, that allowed bombing through cloud cover. Pathfinder aircraft equipped with H-2X would lead formations, dropping marker flares over targets obscured by weather. The Cheyenne tail turret appeared on later B-17GS, a redesigned gun position that gave the tail gunner better visibility and protection. Some aircraft received additional armor plating around crew positions. Engine improvements boosted reliability. Every change reflected lessons learned in blood over Germany. Production reached staggering levels. Boeing's Seattle plant, Douglas in Long Beach, and Lockheed Vega in Burbank operated 24-hour assembly lines. By mid-1944, a new B-17 rolled off production lines every 90 minutes. Workers, many of them women who'd never set foot in a factory before the war, riveted, wired, and assembled the complex bombers with remarkable speed and quality. The total cost per aircraft had actually decreased despite improvements. What began as a $240,000 gamble in 1935 was now being mass-produced for around $204,000 per unit, a testament to American industrial efficiency. But here's where it gets interesting. The B-17's role began to evolve beyond strategic bombing. Some fortresses were converted into air-sea rescue aircraft, painted bright yellow and carrying survival gear to drop to downed airmen in the English Channel or North Sea. These Dumbo aircraft saved hundreds of lives. Others became pathfinders for night operations, leading RAF bomber streams to targets. A few were modified into flying ambulances, bringing wounded soldiers back from forward bases. The versatility of the basic design allowed endless variations. The most unusual modification was the BQ-7, a radio-controlled flying bomb packed with 20,000 pounds of explosives. The idea was simple. A pilot would take off, arm the explosives, then bail out while a chase plane guided the unmanned bomber into German submarine pens or rocket sites via remote control. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., older brother of the future president, died when his BQ-7 exploded prematurely during a test mission in August 1944. Meanwhile, the strategic bombing campaign reached its crescendo. March 1944 saw the first major raid on Berlin, 660 bombers including 400 B-17s striking the German capital. The political impact was enormous. Berliners who'd been told the Luftwaffe protected them now cowered in shelters while American bombs demolished their city in broad daylight. The raids grew larger and more frequent. Some days, over 1,000 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24 Liberators combined, filled German skies. The Luftwaffe was overwhelmed. German day fighter units were systematically destroyed. By summer 1944, Allied fighters roamed German airspace almost unopposed, strafing trains, trucks, and airfields at will. D-Day, June 6, 1944, saw B-17s in a new role, tactical support. Over 1,300 fortresses bombed German coastal defenses ahead of the invasion. While their accuracy was limited by cloud cover, the sheer weight of bombs helped suppress enemy positions. Throughout the Normandy campaign, B-17s struck transportation networks, fuel depots, and troop concentrations. As Allied armies advanced across France, B-17 targets shifted. Oil refineries became priority targets. Without fuel, German tanks, aircraft, and trucks were worthless. Missions to Ploesti, Romania, and synthetic oil plants across Germany systematically destroyed the Reich's petroleum production. By late 1944, German units were immobilized for lack of fuel. Transportation networks came next. Marshalling yards, bridges, and rail junctions were bombed repeatedly. The German economy depended on railways to move coal, iron, and finished weapons. When the rails stopped working, the entire war machine ground down. The crews flying these late-war missions faced different challenges than their 1943 predecessors. Flak remained deadly. German anti-aircraft defenses actually increased as fighter opposition declined. But the Luftwaffe's fighter force was a shadow of its former self. New German jets like the Me-262 appeared, but in too small numbers to change the outcome. Some missions were achingly easy by 1943 standards. Formations flew to targets, dropped bombs, and returned with minimal opposition. Crews almost felt guilty compared to the carnage earlier groups had endured. But other missions remained brutal. December 24, 1944, Christmas Eve, saw one of the largest raids of the war. Over 2,000 bombers struck German airfields and communication centers supporting the Battle of the Bulge. 13 B-17s were lost to Flak and the few remaining German fighters. On Christmas Eve, men still died far from home. By early 1945, B-17 production began winding down. The Boeing Seattle plant built its last fortress on April 13, 1945. Douglas and Lockheed Vega continued production a bit longer, but the writing was on the wall. The B-29 Superfortress, larger, faster, and longer-ranged, was taking over as America's primary strategic bomber. The final tally, 12,731 B-17s built across all variants. More than any other American heavy bomber. They equipped dozens of bomb groups across England, Italy, and the Pacific. They'd flown over 290,000 combat sorties and dropped 640,000 tons of bombs, more than half of all bombs dropped by American aircraft in the European theater. But the numbers don't capture the human reality. Every sortie meant 10 young men betting their lives on aluminum, engines, and each other. Every mission meant someone wouldn't come home. And then came the moment that would define its legacy, the final missions that brought Nazi Germany to its knees. When the war ended in May 1945, the B-17 Flying Fortress had flown its last combat mission over Europe, but its story was far from over. The final major raid came on April 25, 1945. Over 300 B-17s struck the Skoda armament works in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, and Hitler's retreat at Berchtesgaden. German flak was still deadly, 2 fortresses went down, but fighter opposition had ceased to exist. The Luftwaffe was finished. May 7, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Across England, bomber crews celebrated. Men who'd faced death mission after mission could finally believe they'd survive. The odds they'd beaten were staggering. Of the roughly 350,000 men who served in 8th Air Force bomber crews, over 26,000 were killed in action, a casualty rate higher than any other American military branch except submarine service. The B-17's contribution to victory was immense. The 8th Air Force alone flew 291,508 bomber sorties, of which B-17s accounted for over 190,000. They dropped 640,036 tons of bombs on German targets. Strategic bombing didn't win the war alone, nothing ever does, but it crippled German industrial capacity, destroyed the Luftwaffe as an effective force, and diverted massive resources to air defense that could have gone to the Eastern Front. The cost was calculated in more than statistics. 4,735 B-17s were lost in combat over Europe. Another 1,000+ were damaged beyond repair or written off in accidents. At 10 crew members per aircraft, the human toll was staggering. Some crews completed their tours. Most didn't. The average was brutally simple. Fly enough missions, and probability caught up with you. But you won't believe what happened to the surviving fortresses after VE Day. Thousands of B-17s sat on English airfields with no mission. The war in the Pacific continued, but the B-29 superfortress had taken over strategic bombing there. The B-17, for all its achievements, was suddenly obsolete. The U.S. military began a massive disposal program. Hundreds of fortresses were flown to scrapyards and cut up for aluminum. Engines were removed, instruments salvaged, and the airframes reduced to metal ingots. Aircraft that had survived hell over Germany were destroyed by cutting torches in peaceful fields. Some found new purposes. The Air Force retained several hundred for transport, training, and testing roles. Others were converted to air-sea rescue configuration, serving into the 1950s. A few became executive transports, their gun turrets removed and interiors fitted with comfortable seating. Foreign air forces acquired surplus B-17s. Britain, France, Brazil, and others operated fortresses in various roles through the late 1940s. The Israeli Air Force used 3 B-17GS during their 1948 War of Independence, bombing Egyptian positions. These were among the last fortresses to see combat. The most unusual post-war role was civilian. Some B-17s were converted into cargo transports, crop dusters, aerial survey aircraft, and even luxury airliners. One spent years as a firebomber, dropping water and retardant on forest fires. The rugged airframe that survived German flak proved equally capable of hauling freight or fighting fires. But the fortress's legacy extended beyond its physical service. The B-17 proved several concepts that shaped military aviation for decades. Strategic bombing, the idea that you could destroy an enemy's ability to wage war through airpower alone, became a cornerstone of American military doctrine. The Cold War's nuclear deterrent strategy descended directly from B-17 missions over Germany. Precision daylight bombing, though imperfect with 1940s technology, established principles that guided development of smart weapons and GPS-guided munitions. The modern Air Force's ability to strike targets anywhere on Earth with minimal collateral damage traces its lineage back to bombardiers hunched over Norden sights in B-17s. The defensive firepower concept, a bomber that fights its way through enemy defenses, influenced aircraft design into the jet age. The B-52 Stratofortress, still serving 70 years after its first flight, carries tail guns for defense, a direct descendant of B-17 philosophy. Technology developed for the Fortress became standard on all aircraft. Turbo superchargers for high-altitude performance. Self-sealing fuel tanks. Advanced oxygen systems. Heated flight suits. Even the humble pre-flight checklist, created after the prototype crash, is now universal in aviation. The human legacy is equally profound. An entire generation of American airmen learned to fly, fight, and survive in B-17s. After the war, these veterans brought military discipline, technical expertise, and leadership skills into civilian life. They became airline pilots, aerospace engineers, business leaders, and politicians. Their experience shaped post-war America. Today, remarkably few B-17s survive. Of 12,731 built, only about 45 remain in any condition. Fewer than a dozen are airworthy, maintained by dedicated organizations like the Commemorative Air Force, the Collings Foundation, and the EAA. These flying fortresses appear at airshows, giving modern audiences a glimpse of history. The sound of four Wright Cyclone engines at full power is unmistakable, a deep, throaty roar that once meant hope to occupied Europe and terror to Nazi Germany. When a B-17 flies overhead, veterans who flew them often weep. The memories flood back, the friends lost, the mission survived, the youth spent facing death at 25,000 feet. The most famous surviving B-17 is Memphis Belle, now restored and displayed at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Millions have seen it. The aircraft represents not just one famous crew, but all the young men who climbed aboard fortresses knowing they might not return. Another survivor, 909, flew with the public for decades before a tragic crash in 2019 killed 7 people. The accident highlighted the risks of keeping 75-year-old combat aircraft flying, but also the importance of preserving this history in living form. Museums worldwide display B-17s, the Smithsonian, the Imperial War Museum Duxford, the mighty 8th Air Force Museum. Each represents thousands that didn't survive. Visitors can walk through the cramped fuselage, see the gun positions, and imagine what it was like. Some B-17s rest at the bottom of the English Channel, the North Sea, and lakes across Germany, watery graves for crews who never made it home. Occasionally, one is recovered, its remains treated with the respect due a war memorial. The legacy lives in literature, film, and memory. Memphis Belle, 12 o'clock high, Masters of the Air, stories that keep the B-17's history alive for new generations. Historians continue studying the strategic bombing campaign, debating its effectiveness, its ethics, and its necessity. Looking back, the B-17 Flying Fortress was more than just a machine. It was the weapon that proved American industrial might, technological innovation, and the courage of ordinary men could overcome the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. Looking back, the B-17 Flying Fortress was more than just a machine. It was the aircraft that transformed modern warfare and proved that strategic air power could break an enemy's will to fight. The impact on World War II cannot be overstated. Before the B-17, no nation possessed the ability to strike deep into enemy territory in daylight with precision and survive. The fortress made it possible. German factories that produced tanks, aircraft, and ammunition were systematically destroyed. Oil refineries that fueled the Wehrmacht burned. Transportation networks that moved troops and supplies were shattered. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was ground down through attrition. German fighter production actually increased through 1944 despite the bombing, but pilot losses couldn't be replaced. Experienced aviators who'd survived Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain died over the Reich defending against B-17 formations. Their replacements, barely trained teenagers, stood no chance against veteran American gunners and escorting Mustangs. By late 1944, the German war economy was collapsing. Not from any single raid, but from the cumulative effect of thousands of B-17 sorties. Albert Speer, Nazi armaments minister, later wrote that the bombing campaign made Germany's defeat inevitable. The Reich devoted 2 million workers, 55,000 artillery pieces, and massive resources to air defense, resources desperately needed on the eastern and western fronts. But the B-17's influence extended far beyond 1945. The aircraft introduced technological innovations that became standard across aviation. Turbo superchargers enabled high-altitude flight where modern airliners now cruise. Oxygen systems developed for B-17 crews evolved into systems that allow passengers to fly comfortably at 35,000 feet. Remote-controlled gun turrets pioneered technology later used in everything from tank weapons to spacecraft cameras. The strategic bombing doctrine validated by the B-17 shaped the entire Cold War. The concept that bombers carrying nuclear weapons could deter aggression through threat of massive retaliation descended directly from missions over Germany. SAC, Strategic Air Command. existed because the B-17 proved bombers could reach any target and return. Modern precision strike capabilities trace their ancestry to those Norden bomb sites and bombardiers calculating wind drift and altitude. Today's GPS-guided weapons, delivered by stealth bombers and drones, represent the perfection of principles tested over Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The human impact resonates through generations. The crews who flew B-17s, the ones who survived, carried their experiences into post-war life. They built modern America with the discipline, technical skill, and leadership they'd learned at 25,000 feet over hostile territory. They raised children with stories of courage and sacrifice. Their legacy shaped a nation. The final statistics tell part of the story. 12,731 B-17s built. 291,508 combat sorties flown. 640,036 tons of bombs dropped. 4,735 aircraft lost in combat. Over 46,500 casualties among crew members. These numbers represent the largest strategic bombing campaign in history, a campaign that helped bring Nazi Germany to its knees. But numbers can't capture the human reality. The fear before every mission. The cold at altitude that froze guns and men. The sight of a friend's aircraft exploding. The relief of crossing the English coast after 6 hours of combat. The exhaustion of completing 25 missions when odds said you wouldn't. The guilt of surviving when so many didn't. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its place in history not through perfection, but through effectiveness despite flaws. It wasn't the fastest bomber, the Mosquito was much faster. It didn't carry the heaviest bomb load, the Lancaster carried twice as much. It wasn't invincible, thousands were shot down. What made it legendary was the combination: range, altitude, defensive firepower, structural strength, and the courage of the men who flew it. A B-17 formation could fight its way to Berlin and back. It could absorb damage that would destroy other aircraft and still fly. It could deliver bombs with acceptable accuracy from altitudes where fighters struggled to reach. The nickname, Flying Fortress, turned out to be prophetic. These aircraft became fortresses of hope, fortresses that carried the war to Nazi Germany when ground forces couldn't, that proved America's industrial might, that demonstrated ordinary men could achieve extraordinary things. Today, when a surviving B-17 rumbles overhead at an airshow, it represents more than vintage aviation. It represents a generation's sacrifice. It represents the 26,008th Air Force crew members who never came home. It represents the industrial workers who built them, the engineers who designed them, and the vision of leaders who believed strategic bombing could win wars. The B-17 Flying Fortress remains the most recognized bomber in history. Its distinctive silhouette, 4 engines, high tail, greenhouse nose, is instantly identifiable. Its story continues to fascinate historians, aviation enthusiasts, and anyone who appreciates courage under fire. From a controversial prototype that crashed and burned to the aircraft that helped defeat Nazi Germany, the B-17's journey encapsulates everything remarkable about American airpower in World War II. It proved that innovation, industrial capacity, and human courage could overcome any obstacle. It demonstrated that wars could be won not just on the ground, but from 25,000 feet up in the freezing sky. So there you have it, the complete story of the B-17 Flying Fortress. From Boeing's desperate gamble in 1935 to the strategic bombing campaign that broke Nazi Germany, this aircraft proved that courage and technology combined could achieve the impossible. 12,731 were built, flying over 290,000 combat sorties, and dropping 640,000 tons of bombs on the Third Reich. It remains one of the most iconic aircraft ever built, a symbol of American airpower, industrial might, and the ordinary men who flew extraordinary missions. What impressed you most about this legendary warbird? Was it the crew's courage, the aircraft's toughness, or the sheer scale of the bombing campaign? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more deep dives into WWII's greatest aircraft, subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're covering every legendary warbird from the Spitfire to the P-51 Mustang. Thanks for watching WWII Aviation, and I'll see you in the next one.